You know that feeling, that deep down idea that you are essentially on your own, a completely autonomous person holding rights, driven by your own goals.
That core belief, the one that really defines so much of modern life in the West.
Exactly. Well, what if I told you that idea didn't really kick off with, say, the Founding Fathers or some Enlightenment salon?
What if it started way, way back?
Way back in ancient Greece, with something as basic as, well, dust and empty space.
Sounds unlikely, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone, to AI History of Western Philosophy. We're the show that tries to dig into the hidden backstories, the genealogies of the big ideas that shape how you think and live today.
And today, we've got a really fascinating one.
Before we dive in, though, just the necessary bit of housekeeping for you, our listener. This is AI History of Western Philosophy.
Right.
And AI-generated content like this show, it confabulates. It can present ideas as solid fact when maybe they aren't quite. Now, our subject is philosophy, but we want to be clear. We are not philosophers ourselves.
No, definitely not.
AI History of Western Philosophy's mission, really, apart from pointing you towards the original thinkers, is to kind of play with philosophy as raw material, to experiment and maybe spark some new ways of thinking about things.
And today, what we're trying to do is give you a kind of intellectual shortcut. We want to help you understand perhaps the most dominant idea in the modern West, this thing called hyper-individualism.
Where does it come from?
Exactly. We're going to trace its conceptual roots, showing how a concept, amazingly, from ancient physics, the atom got transformed over, 2,000 years?
Yeah, easily.
Into the political, the social, even the psychological atom that makes up the modern self. Our goal is basically to map the entire family tree of what we're calling the atomized self.
And just so we're clear, when we say hyper-individualism, what are we really talking about?
We're talking about that extreme focus, maybe even an exaggerated focus, on your personal autonomy, your self-interest, your self-realization.
To the point where it can actually work against, say, collective projects or social bonds?
Mm-hmm. Precisely. It often comes at the expense of thinking about the group, about shared well-being. It's kind of the air we breathe now, culturally speaking.
It really feels that way sometimes.
It does. And the starting point for tracing this idea, as you hinted, is really quite surprising. We have to go all the way back to a pre-Socratic thinker.
Before Plato, before Aristotle.
Right. Democritus of Abdera. He was working around the 5th century BCE. Now, he was focused purely on understanding material reality, the physical world.
Physics, basically.
Pure physics. Yet somehow, his work laid down this fundamental philosophical blueprint. It was reductionist, it was materialist, and crucially, it was non-teleological, no grand purpose.
And that worldview, centuries later, got picked up and used by Western society to define you.
It's an incredible story of conceptual migration.
Okay, let's really unpack this Democritus blueprint then, this radical materialism, because you're saying it becomes this absolutely essential metaphor for political thought way down the line.
It really does. So Democritus, and we should also mention his mentor Leucippus.
Right, often credited together.
They proposed an ontology, a theory about what fundamentally exists that was just revolutionary in its simplicity and its materialism. They argued the universe is made up of only 2 fundamental things.
Okay, what are they?
First, an infinite number of absolutely tiny, invisibly small, solid particles. They're all made of the same stuff, essentially, but have different shapes and sizes, and they're eternal. He called these atomos.
Atomos meaning uncuttable, right? Indivisible.
Exactly. The fundamental, indivisible unit of reality. That's the first thing.
And the second?
Equally crucial. The infinite void. Or keinon, empty space.
Why was the void so important?
Because the atoms needed something to move through. Think about it. This idea was actually a brilliant solution to a huge philosophical problem that had kind of paralyzed thinkers before them.
You mean that whole struggle between permanence and change?
Yeah.
How can things seem stable but also clearly be in flux?
Precisely that.
Yeah.
You had earlier philosophers, like Thales, looking for one single underlying continuous substance, maybe water, maybe air.
Trying to find the permanent stuff.
Right. But then you get Parmenides, who argues very logically that if reality is truly one, continuous, and completely full, then motion and change must be illusions. Because where could anything possibly move to if there's no empty space?
It's a dead end, philosophically.
It seemed like one. Democritus' solution was just elegant. The atoms themselves, they provide the permanence. They are eternal and unchanging in their substance.
Okay.
But the void, That allows for motion, for rearrangement, for flux. Things come together, things break apart all within this empty space. He managed to reconcile being and becoming, permanence and change.
And how did things move? What was the driving force in this atomic universe? Was it divine?
Absolutely not. That's the key. The system is relentlessly mechanistic and non-teleological. There's no goal, no purpose, no divine plan.
So just stuff bumping into other stuff.
Pretty much. Everything, the formation of entire worlds, the growth of plants and animals, life, death, the decay, it all just results from the constant, eternal, uncaused motion of these atoms. They're constantly moving through the void. They collide, they rebound. Sometimes, because they have different shapes, Democritus imagined all sorts: hooks, spheres, jagged edges they might tangle up or hook together.
And that forms bigger objects, like a table or a tree.
Exactly. Macroscopic objects are just temporary arrangements of these atoms locked together by their shapes. And when they get hit by other atoms hard enough or just naturally jostle apart, the object dissolves back into its constituent particles.
So no creator god putting things together. No ultimate purpose, or telos, as the Greeks called it.
None whatsoever. It's just the necessary random mechanical interaction of fundamental matter. This absence of purpose, this non-teleological aspect, is what makes the system so purely reductionist.
Meaning you could explain everything just by looking at the smallest part.
Yes. Everything complex can be reduced down to the properties and interactions of these basic, indivisible units. It's a bottom-up explanation for everything.
Okay, so if the whole universe is just atoms and void mechanically interacting, what does that make a human being?
Well, following the logic, a human being is simply another temporary, very complex aggregate of these moving atoms, a configuration.
Even the mind, consciousness, the soul.
Especially the soul. This was perhaps the most radical part. For Democritus, the soul itself is material. It's not some spooky, ethereal stuff. It's made of atoms, too.
What kind of atoms?
The very finest, smoothest, roundest, and therefore most mobile atoms of all. He called them fire atoms. Not literally fire, but like fire in their ability to move quickly and interpenetrate other things.
So these supermobile spherical particles are what make us alive, animate us, allow thought.
That's the core idea. These fire atoms are distributed throughout the body's atomic structure, and they provide the life, the sensation, the thought. They're the organizing, animating principle, but they're still just physical atoms.
Wow. And what does this model imply about, well, death? What happens to the individual?
It dictates it completely. Life, according to this model, is maintained by breathing. Respiration constantly brings in new soul atoms from the surrounding air to replenish the ones that are always naturally escaping from the body into the void.
So you're constantly losing and regaining these soul particles.
Exactly. Death, then, is simply the physical cessation of breathing. The supply of new soul atoms stops, and the ones already in the body quickly disperse, scattering back out into the infinite void, along with all the body's other atoms.
No afterlife, no personal immortality, no divine judgment.
Absolutely none. That's a critical point, especially for how this idea eventually feeds into individualism. In Democritus' system, the individual is entirely finite, a local, temporary, material configuration, a complex swirl of atomic dust that forms, holds for a while, and then dissolves completely.
That sounds potentially quite bleak. Yet Democritus famously got the nickname the laughing philosopher. How does that square with this stark materialism?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But for Democritus, the bleakness was actually liberating. His philosophy aimed to remove the two greatest sources of human anxiety and misery.
Which were?
The fear of capricious gods interfering in your life, and the terror of death and whatever might come after.
Ah, I see. If the universe is just atoms and void working by necessity,
then there are no angry gods to appease. And if death is simply the complete dissolution of your atomic structure,
then there's literally nothing to fear about being dead. It's just non-existence. Annihilation.
Precisely. Annihilation, but therefore also freedom from fear. And that freedom from fear is the foundation for his ethical framework.
Which centered on achieving euthymia, tranquility, contentment.
Yes, euthymia.
Yeah.
Since there's no divine report card or afterlife reward, the highest possible good you can achieve in this life is this deep-seated cheerfulness, tranquility, or contentment.
Peace of mind. And how do you get it? Not through chasing pleasure, presumably.
No, not primarily through external things like wealth or intense sensory pleasures, which are fleeting and often lead to disturbance. You achieve euthymia through rational understanding of the way things truly are.
By accepting the atoms and void reality.
Exactly. If you truly understand that everything, including your own body, your sensations, your emotions, is just the result of atomic interactions governed by necessity, then you can cultivate moderation, prudence, and rational acceptance. You learn to limit your desires because you understand the finite nature of reality and yourself.
Okay, before we move on from Democritus's physics, we absolutely have to talk about something you mentioned earlier, this distinction he made between reality and convention. Because you said this became a crucial tool for later political thought.
Yes, this epistemological point is maybe the sharpest tool Democritus forged. He was very clear. What exists in reality are only two things.
Atoms and void.
Atoms and void, full stop. Our sensory experiences, things like sweetness, bitterness, warmth, cold, colors, these are not inherent properties of the atoms themselves. They are subjective experiences.
Secondary qualities.
Exactly. They are produced only by the interaction between the atoms of external objects and the atoms that make up our sense organs. They don't exist independently out there in the world.
Can you give an example?
His famous one was taste. The perception of sweetness, he thought, is caused by atoms that are relatively large, round, and smooth. They interact gently, sort of rolling over the atoms of the tongue.
Okay.
The perception of bitterness, on the other hand, might be caused by atoms that are small, sharp, maybe jagged. They tear or prick at the tongue's atoms, causing that different sensation. The sweetness or bitterness isn't in the object itself, it's the result of the interaction.
It's purely relational.
Purely relational and subjective to the perceiver. This led him to that famous, incredibly influential dictum, by convention sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms and void.
So our senses only give us access to the conventional world, the world of appearances, true knowledge.
True knowledge, grasping the underlying reality of atoms and void, is only accessible through reason, through the intellect. The senses are useful, but ultimately unreliable guides to the fundamental nature of things.
Right. I can see how powerful that distinction is. So now, let's make the leap. How does this model, atoms, void, reality versus convention, become the blueprint, the conceptual DNA for social atomism centuries later?
It offers a ready-made conceptual structure, a kind of template for thinking about society and politics. The atomists essentially handed later thinkers three indispensable concepts.
Okay, what's the first one?
Ontological primacy of the unit. In Democritus's physics, the atom is the sole, primary, fundamental reality. Everything else, world, rocks, plants, animals, my direction, is secondary.
Just an aggregate.
Yeah.
Derivative, temporary.
Exactly. Now, map that directly onto politics. What's the primary unit?
The individual.
The individual. Society, the state, the community, these become secondary, derivative, temporary aggregates. Society is seen as nothing but a collection of individuals. This establishes the individual as ontologically prior to, more fundamental than, the group.
Which immediately suggests the second point you mentioned, methodological reductionism.
Yes. If the individual is the fundamental reality, then the way to understand the whole society is entirely by analyzing the properties, motivations, and interactions of its component parts, the individuals. You explain the macro by reducing it to the micro.
Social phenomena are just the sum of individual action.
In this view, yes. And the third crucial element is the conceptual mapping of that reality-convention distinction onto political life. Remember, Democritus gave us this two-tiered model. Fundamental objective reality, atoms void, versus the secondary subjective conventional world, sensory qualities.
How does that map onto politics?
It provides the deep structure for social contract theory. Later thinkers, like Hobbes and Locke, who we'll get to, implicitly or explicitly use this structure.
I think I see it now. The state of nature, that pre-social condition they imagine.
That becomes the political equivalent of atoms and void. It's posited as the fundamental, objective, pre-conventional reality of human existence before society imposes its rules.
Just individuals bouncing off each other, maybe chaotically like Hobbes thought, or maybe with some basic natural laws like Locke.
Exactly. And then society, law, government, these become the conventional secondary constructs. They are the political equivalent of the subjective sensory qualities.
Created by agreement, by convention.
Right. Created by human agreement to make life less dangerous or more convenient than the raw, underlying atomic state of nature. So Democritus, even though he wasn't talking about politics at all, accidentally provided the fundamental conceptual architecture for social contract theory. The blueprint was there.
It's incredible that a model of physics could have such a long reach into politics. But then, as you said, this powerful blueprint kind of goes underground, doesn't it? For what, 1,500 years?
Yeah, roughly. It was largely suppressed or ignored because its core tenets, materialism, mechanism, no divine purpose, no immortal soul, were just completely incompatible with the philosophies that came to dominate the West.
Platonism, Aristotelianism, and especially later, Christian theology built on Aristotle.
Exactly. Those systems emphasized purpose, hierarchy, immaterial forms or souls, and often a divine creator. Atomism was seen as dangerous, atheistic.
So how did this radical idea, the atom, manage to survive? How did it eventually reemerge to become so central to the Enlightenment?
It survived through a couple of really critical phases of, let's say, adaptation and, frankly, theological engineering. The first absolutely essential bridge was built almost immediately after Democritus by Epicurus.
Epicurus, active around the late 4th, early 3rd century BCE.
Right. Now, Epicurus, while he fiercely claimed philosophical independence, basically adopted the Democritan atoms and void model wholesale. It was the foundation for his own system.
But he had a problem with it, didn't he? Something about determinism.
He had a huge problem. Democritus' system, with its atoms just following necessary mechanical laws, was rigidly deterministic. Everything that happens has to happen exactly that way.
Cause and effect, all the way down.
Right. But if everything is predetermined, then there's no room for human free will. And if there's no free will, there's no moral responsibility. And if there's no moral responsibility, well, what's the point of ethics?
And Epicurus' whole philosophy was about ethics, right? Achieving ataraxia, tranquility.
Exactly. His system was intensely practical, focused on how to live a good, calm life through rational choices. So he needed a way out of Democritian determinism. He needed to inject some possibility, some chance, into the atomic machine.
And this is where we get the famous, or maybe infamous, atomic swerve, the Kleneman.
The Kleneman. It might be the most consequential philosophical footnote in history. Epicurus just sort of posited it. He claimed that atoms, as they fall through the void, he imagined them falling downwards, though that's physically dubious, are capable of a completely uncaused, unpredictable, absolutely minuscule deviation. A tiny, spontaneous swerve off their otherwise determined path.
So it wasn't derived from the physics, he just added it.
He just added it. It's an assertion of pure chance, a break in the causal chain, introduced specifically to solve the ethical problem.
And what did this tiny swerve achieve? Philosophically.
It broke the lockstep of Democritian necessity. It introduced an element of randomness, of contingency into the universe. And crucially for Epicurus, this physical possibility of uncaused movement provided the physical basis for human free will.
How so?
The idea, roughly, is that the swerve allows for a break in the chain of cause and effect within the atoms of the soul, enabling genuinely free choices that aren't predetermined by prior atomic collisions. Without the swerve, no free will, no rational choice. With the swerve, the individual gains moral agency, the ability to choose pleasure, understood as the absence of pain and fear, over pain, which is the heart of Epicurean ethics.
And did Epicurus also develop the social implications hinted at by Democritus?
Oh, absolutely. He formalized it. Epicurus argued very clearly that things like justice and laws are not natural or divinely ordained. They are purely human inventions.
Conventions again?
Pure conventions. Justice, he said, is basically a social compact, an agreement people make not to harm one another, purely for mutual benefit and security. It allows individuals to pursue their own goal of ataraxia without constant fear of being attacked or cheated. It directly links the atomic view of the individual to a utilitarian, conventional view of society.
And how were these Epicurean ideas built on the atom preserved?
Primarily, almost miraculously, through one single magnificent text. The Latin epic poem De Rerum Natura on the Nature of Things, written by the Roman poet Lucretius in the 1st century BCE.
Lucretius basically laid out the entire Epicurean system. Atoms, swerve, ethics, critique of religion, all in verse.
He did. It's an astonishing work. And it's largely thanks to the survival of copies of De Rerum Natura that atomism wasn't completely lost.
Which brings us to the next crucial moment. The Renaissance rediscovery.
Yes. In 1417, a papal secretary named Poggio Bracciolini discovered a manuscript of Lucretius's poem in a German monastery library. And suddenly, after lying dormant for centuries, this incredibly sophisticated, coherent, and profoundly materialistic worldview burst back onto the European intellectual scene.
And it must have been dynamite. A complete explanation for the universe without needing a creator god, without providence, without an immortal soul.
It was intellectually thrilling, but theologically terrifying. It offered a direct challenge to the entire Christian worldview that underpinned European society and thought. For atomism to become usable, for it to fuel the scientific revolution and eventually political philosophy, it somehow had to be made safe. It needed to be reconciled with Christianity.
It needed a theological makeover.
It needed essentially to be baptized. And the man who performed this crucial philosophical operation was Pierre Gassendi.
A 17th century French Catholic priest, interestingly enough.
A priest, a scholar, a philosopher. Gassendi saw the immense explanatory power of the atomistic mechanical model, especially for the new sciences that were emerging. But he knew it couldn't be adopted as long as it was tied to atheism. So he systematically re-engineered atomism to make it compatible with Christian doctrine.
How did he do that? What were the key modifications?
He made 3 absolutely crucial changes. First, he tackled the idea of an eternal, infinite universe of atoms, which Democritus and Epicurus held. Gassendi rejected that.
What did he put in its place?
He stipulated that God, the omnipotent creator, created a finite number of atoms ex nihilo out of nothing at the moment of creation. This preserved God's absolute power and denied that matter was co-eternal with God.
Okay, so God creates the atoms. What about their motion? Democritus thought motion was just inherent and necessary.
Gassendi changed that too. He argued that God wasn't just the creator of the atoms, he was also the first cause of their motion. God endowed the atoms with their specific capacity for movement when he created them. Motion itself becomes a divine gift, not just a brute fact of matter.
Right, so God creates the atoms and sets them in motion. That deals with the physics. But what about the really tricky part, the soul? Democritus's material soul was completely unacceptable.
That was the masterstroke. Gassendi categorically rejected the material soul made of fire atoms. Instead, he introduced a sharp, clean dualism, building on Descartes in some ways.
How did his dualism work?
He argued that yes, the physical body and even the sensitive or biological soul, responsible for basic life functions, instincts, could be explained mechanically through the interaction of atoms, fine, but the rational soul, the intellectual soul, the part responsible for reason, self-awareness, understanding God, that, Gassendi insisted, was fundamentally different. It was an immaterial, indivisible, and immortal substance.
Not made of atoms at all.
Not made of atoms at all. It was directly created and infused into the human body by God alone.
That's the firewall, isn't it? It separates the mechanical body from the spiritual soul.
It's the crucial firewall. This dualism allowed subsequent thinkers, especially those working on the new science of man, like Hobbes and Locke, to fully embrace the explanatory power of mechanistic, atomistic models for human behavior, psychology, and even politics.
Without being accused of the ultimate heresy, denying the existence of an immaterial, immortal soul created by God.
Exactly. Gassendi's Christianized atomism transformed the doctrine from a dangerous atheistic fringe idea into a legitimate, respectable foundation for the mechanical philosophy that swept through the 17th century. He essentially gave atomism its ticket to the Enlightenment Party, paving the way for the formal birth of social atomism in political thought.
Okay, so Gassendi makes atomism safe, theologically speaking. Now we hit the 17th century, and political philosophers explicitly pick up this mechanistic reductionist ball and run with it.
They absolutely do. And the shared starting point, the fundamental premise for the giants we're about to discuss, Hobbes and Locke, is precisely what Gassendi enabled. The individual is primary. Society is secondary, artificial, a construct created by these primary individuals.
Let's start with Thomas Hobbes. His Leviathan, published in 1651, feels like the purest, most bracing application of this mechanical philosophy to politics.
It really is uncompromising. Hobbes starts right down at the level of human psychology, and it's thoroughly mechanistic.
Ow.
For Hobbes, human beings are essentially complex machines, automata, self-moving engines. Our thoughts, they're just motions in the brain. Our feelings are decisions. They are all driven by fundamental internal motions, internal forces he calls appetite and aversion.
Appetite being motion towards something we perceive as good.
Yeah.
Aversion, motion away from something we perceive as evil.
Exactly. And good and evil for Hobbes are just labels we give to the objects of our appetites and aversions. There's no objective morality out there. Humans are, by their mechanical nature, perpetually self-interested. We're constantly seeking more power, more resources to ensure our own continued motion, our self-preservation. And this drive only stops, he famously says, in death.
It's a pretty stark view of human nature as just a bundle of self-interested drives in a machine body.
It is.
Yeah.
And this mechanistic psychology directly dictates what his famous state of nature must look like. If individuals are just these self-interested machines,
Then putting them together without any overarching power must be chaos. It's the political equivalent of Democritus's atoms randomly colliding in the void, isn't it?
It's a perfect analogy. Hobbes describes the state of nature, the condition before government, as a state where there's no common law, no industry, no culture, no morality that's actually enforced. Because everyone is driven by self-interest and the right to everything, it inevitably becomes a war of every man against every man. Bellum omnium contra omnes.
Where life is.
The famous quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's an intolerable condition because the individual atom, pursuing its own preservation, constantly clashes violently with every other individual atom doing the same.
But wait, if they're all just selfish machines at war, how on earth do they ever get out of this state? How can they possibly form a stable society?
Well, they do it for purely selfish mechanical reasons, too. Reason, which Hobbes also sees as a kind of calculation, shows these automata that the state of nature is suicidal.
Rational self-interest dictates finding a way out.
Exactly. The fear of death, the desire for comfort and security, these fundamental drives compel individuals to seek peace. They realize, through reason, that the only way to escape the constant war is to give up their absolute natural liberty.
They make a contract.
They make a social contract. They agree amongst themselves to transfer their individual rights and powers to a sovereign authority. This sovereign, the Leviathan, is what Hobbes calls an artificial man.
An artificial aggregate, like a giant machine built from the smaller machines.
Precisely. The Leviathan is this vast, powerful entity, ideally an absolute monarch for Hobbes, created by the voluntary agreement of individuals. Its purpose is simple, to impose order and security through the sheer terror of its punishment. Fear is the mechanism that keeps the selfish atoms in line.
So society, the Commonwealth, is entirely an artifact. A piece of political technology.
Completely. It's secondary, instrumental, created by the individuals for the individual's primary goal of self-preservation. It has no inherent value beyond its usefulness in stopping the war of all against all. It's social atomism in its bleakest, most powerful form.
Okay, that's Hobbes. Now let's pivot to the other giant of 17th century political thought, John Locke. His two treatises of government, published around 1689, offers a very different picture, but does it still start from that same atomistic premise?
It absolutely does. Locke also begins his argument in a state of nature, confirming that the individual is primary and exists logically before society or government. But his individual, his social atom, is fundamentally different from Hobbes's.
How so? Not just a selfish machine.
No. For Locke, the individual in the state of nature is not just a creature of appetite and aversion, but a creature of God and, crucially, reason. Locke argues that humans are born with natural, inherent, inalienable rights.
The famous ones. Life, liberty, and property.
Life, liberty, and estate, which he uses broadly to include property. These rights exist prior to any government. They are endowed by God or by natural law, apprehended through reason. So, Locke starts with a rights-bearing atom.
That's a huge difference right there. And what is Locke's state of nature like? Is it the same brutal war as Hobbes?
No, not necessarily. Locke describes the state of nature as a state of perfect freedom and also a state of equality governed by the law of nature, which reason teaches everyone. That law dictates that because everyone is equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in their life, health, liberty, or possessions.
So it could potentially be peaceful. Using reason could coexist.
In theory, yes. People can generally cooperate. However, Locke argues, the state of nature suffers from some serious inconveniences. It's not hellish like Hobbes, but it's unstable.
What are these inconveniences? Why leave it?
He identifies three main ones. First, there's no established, settled, known law that everyone agrees on as the standard for right and wrong. Second, there's no known and indifferent judge with authority to settle disputes according to that law.
Everyone is their own judge.
Exactly. Everyone is judge, jury, and executioner in their own case when their rights are violated. And third, there's often no reliable power to back up and enforce a just sentence.
So disputes can easily escalate. Self-interest and passion take over from reason.
Precisely. Even if it's not a constant state of war, the lack of impartial justice and enforcement makes the enjoyment of property and rights very uncertain. Conflicts spiral.
So the motivation for forming civil society, for making the social contract in Locke's view, isn't sheer terror like Hobbes. It's more about convenience, securing rights.
It's exactly that. The move to government is based on rational consent to remedy those inconveniences and provide a more secure environment for protecting the natural rights you already possess. The social contract is purely instrumental.
And the government they create, Not an absolute Leviathan, presumably.
Definitely not. Individuals consent to form a political society and set up a government, but they don't surrender all their rights. The government acts as a trustee.
A trustee, meaning?
Meaning it's entrusted with specific, limited powers, primarily to make laws, judge disputes fairly, and enforce those laws for the sole purpose of protecting the people's life, liberty, and property. It's a tool created by the people and accountable to the people.
And if the government breaks that trust, if it violates natural rights,
then the people have the right to dissolve it and establish a new one. The ultimate sovereignty always remains with the individual members of society.
So despite the vast differences in the kind of government they end up justifying, Hobbes's absolutism versus Locke's limited constitutionalism, the underlying atomistic assumption is the same.
It's absolutely the same foundational assumption. For both thinkers, the individual with inherent interests, drives, or rights exists first. The individual is the ultimate source of political authority and legitimacy. Society is an artificial construct built by these individuals for their own purposes. The classical idea that the community forms the individual has been completely turned on its head. Now, the individual atoms form the community. The conceptual journey from Democritus's physical particle to the foundational political unit is essentially complete. But, it's really crucial to grasp that this social atomism, this tradition running from Democritus through Hobbes and Locke, powerful as it was, wasn't acting alone. It was only one leg of what you might call a conceptual tripod, supporting the modern idea of the individual.
A tripod. What were the other two legs?
Modern hyper-individualism is so potent, so deeply ingrained, because it's the result of this incredible confluence, this merging of three distinct but complementary intellectual streams. The political material one we've just traced, but also an epistemological rational one and a theological moral one.
Okay, let's take the second leg then. The epistemological foundation. Who provides that?
Primarily René Descartes, working in the mid-17th century, around the same time as Hobbes. While Hobbes was busy defining the human body as machine, Descartes was doing something equally profound for the human mind.
With his famous cogito ergo sum.
Exactly. Descartes embarked on this project of radical doubt. He decided to systematically set aside any belief that could possibly be doubted, searching for one absolutely certain foundation for knowledge.
And what was the only thing he found he couldn't doubt?
He couldn't doubt the fact that he was doubting, that he was thinking. The very act of doubting proved the existence of a thinking entity. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
What was the significance of that realization?
It established individual consciousness, your own private internal experience of thinking, as the absolute unshakable starting point for all knowledge and certainty. The self-aware thinking self becomes epistemologically primary, just as the atom was physically primary for Democritus or the individual politically primary for Hobbes and Locke. It enthrones the individual mind as sovereign in the realm of truth.
And didn't Descartes also make that sharp distinction between mind and body?
He did. He cemented the famous mind-body dualism, arguing for a fundamental split between two kinds of substance in the universe. Res extensa, extended substance, meaning physical matter, which was mechanical and divisible, and res cogitans, thinking substance, meaning the mind, which was immaterial, non-extended, and indivisible.
So the true self for Descartes is the mind, the res cogitans.
Yes. The core of your identity, the source of your consciousness and reason, is this immaterial thinking substance. It's fundamentally separate from the mechanical body it happens to inhabit.
So this defines the modern self as essentially a rational, self-aware mind, autonomous, self-contained, and kind of detached from the physical body and the external social world. It feels like the origin of that mind over matter idea, where the real you is your thinking self.
Precisely. Cartesianism provided the philosophical framework for seeing the individual as, first and foremost, a discrete, autonomous mind existing in its own private epistemological space. And this model perfectly complemented social atomism, which was busy defining the individual as a discrete, autonomous body existing in political space.
The two models reinforced each other, creating this image of a self-contained, self-sufficient unit, both mentally and politically.
Exactly. They work together beautifully to solidify the concept of the individual as the fundamental building block of reality, knowledge, and society.
Okay, so we have the political material leg, atomism, and the epistemological rational leg, Cartesianism. What's the third leg of this tripod supporting modern individualism?
The third leg is the theological and moral foundation. And this comes largely from the Protestant Reformation, which obviously started much earlier in the 16th century, but its deep psychological and cultural effects really crystallized and spread during the 17th century alongside these other developments.
How did the Reformation contribute to individualism? It wasn't about physics or logic, was it?
No, it was about something much more personal, spiritual autonomy. Think about the core principles of the Reformation, especially as articulated by Martin Luther.
Things like solidified salvation by faith alone, not by works.
Right. And sola scriptura, the Bible alone, as the source of religious authority, not church tradition or the Pope. And perhaps most importantly, the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant radically dissolving the traditional need for a priestly hierarchy, for the church as an intermediary between the individual and God. If every believer is, in a sense, their own priest, and if scripture and faith are paramount.
Then the ultimate authority shifts inward, to the individual's own conscience.
Precisely. The individual believer gains a direct, unmediated, intensely personal relationship with God. The locus of religious authority moves from the external institution to the internal conviction of the individual conscience. That's a massive boost for individualism in the spiritual realm.
That sounds quite liberating. But didn't the sociologist Max Weber, in his famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, argue that it also created a huge amount of anxiety, especially within Calvinism?
Weber's analysis here is absolutely crucial for understanding the psychological dimension of modern individualism. He looked particularly at Calvinist branches of Protestantism, which emphasized the doctrine of predestination.
The idea that God has already decided from eternity who is going to be saved, the elect, and who is going to be damned, and there's nothing you can do to change your fate.
Exactly. Now, Weber argued this doctrine created an unbearable psychological burden, an intense, crushing spiritual anxiety. How could you live with the constant uncertainty, not knowing whether you were one of the chosen or one of the damned?
There was no way to know for sure. No sacraments or good works could guarantee it.
Not in the strictest Calvinist view. So, Weber argued, people desperately started looking for signs of election in their worldly lives. They needed some kind of empirical, verifiable indication that they might be among the saved just to cope with the anxiety.
And where do they find these signs?
They found them, Weber claimed, in intense, methodical, rational activity within the world. This is what he called inner-worldly asceticism. Since you couldn't earn salvation, the psychological impulse was to prove to yourself and others that you possess the qualities of the elect.
How? Through hard work. Discipline.
Rigorous hard work in your calling or profession, yes.
Huh.
Also, extreme self-discipline, frugality, avoiding worldly pleasures, and meticulously planning your life. Success in your worldly endeavors, particularly economic success achieved through these disciplined means, came to be interpreted psychologically as a possible sign of God's favor, evidence that you might be one of the elect.
So this religious anxiety accidentally forged a specific personality type.
That was Weber's argument. It forged the personality type perfectly suited for the rise of modern capitalism. Highly rational, incredibly self-disciplined, focused on individual achievement and responsibility, methodical in planning, and driven by a powerful inner compulsion to work and succeed. The individual became morally and spiritually obligated to rely solely on their own efforts and discipline.
Wow. So putting it all together then, the Enlightenment essentially synthesizes these three streams.
Yes. The Enlightenment takes this now fully formed concept of the individual and applies it everywhere. You have the rights-bearing political body inherited from Locke and social atomism. You have it inhabited by the rational, self-certain, autonomous mind defined by Descartes. And you have it motivated by this intense, inner-directed, self-disciplined drive for worldly success and personal responsibility, psychologically shaped by the Protestant ethic.
That's a potent combination.
Yeah.
And you can see it clearly in someone like Adam Smith, right? With the invisible hand.
Absolutely. Smith's economic theory in The Wealth of Nations is a perfect example of the culmination. The complex, seemingly ordered system of the market emerges naturally, even beneficially, not from centralized planning, but simply from countless individuals pursuing their own self-interest.
It's an emergent property of these atomistic economic agents interacting.
Exactly. The overall social good happens as if guided by an invisible hand, precisely because everyone is acting as a rational, self-interested individual unit. This three-part framework, political, epistemological, and moral psychological, provided the cultural bedrock for the pervasive individualism we still see today.
Okay, so we've traced this idea of the individual atom from ancient physics through the Enlightenment's rational, rights-bearing citizen.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? You mentioned earlier this concept of hyper-individualism. Where did that come in?
That's the final, and you could argue, more radical stage in this long trajectory. It really takes off in the late 20th century, particularly from the 1980s onwards, with the rise and global spread of the ideology we call neoliberalism.
Associated with figures like Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US.
Those are the iconic political champions, yes. Neoliberalism, fundamentally, is an ideology that doesn't just advocate for free markets within society. It seeks to remake all of society, all human relations, according to the logic of the free market.
The market becomes the model for everything.
It becomes the ultimate arbiter of value, the most efficient mechanism for allocating resources, and the ideal template for human interaction. The core policy prescriptions flow directly from this. Widespread privatization of previously public services, healthcare, education, utilities, deregulation of industries, deep cuts to social welfare programs and safety nets, weakening unions, and promoting global free trade.
The idea being that government intervention, collective action, just distorts the market's natural efficiency.
Exactly. The belief is that the unimpeded market generates the best outcomes. And this ideology had profound implications for how the individual was understood. It took the existing social atomism and pushed it to an extreme.
How so? By rejecting the collective even more forcefully.
Precisely. Neoliberalism, in its purest form, almost denies the reality of society itself, reducing everything back down to the individual atom. This is where you get that infamous, incredibly revealing quote from Margaret Thatcher in 1987.
The one about society.
Yes. She said, quite starkly, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families."
Wow. That's about as clear an expression of radical social atomism as you could possibly get. It basically says anything beyond the individual and the immediate family unit is either an illusion or maybe even an illegitimate abstraction.
It perfectly captures the endpoint of that reductionist logic. And if society doesn't really exist, only individuals do, then the role and identity of that individual gets completely recast.
How does it get recast? The Enlightenment gave us the citizen.
Neoliberalism tends to replace the citizen, someone understood as a member of a political community with shared rights and responsibilities, with two other figures, the consumer and the entrepreneur of the self.
The consumer, whose primary mode of interaction is choosing between goods and services in the market.
Yes. And the entrepreneur of the self, this idea that you as an individual are essentially a business. You are a unit of human capital.
Human capital, like a resource to be invested in.
Exactly. Your value, your skills, your health, your education, even your personality and connections is seen primarily in terms of its market worth, its potential for generating profit or return on investment. Your life becomes a project of constantly managing and enhancing your personal brand, your marketability, your competitive edge. You become a company of one.
So hyper-individualism, then, is this intensified, maybe even exaggerated form of individualism that emerges from this neoliberal worldview.
That's a good way to put it. It's an extreme focus on personal autonomy, self-reliance, and self-realization, often defined in market terms. And crucially, it often frames the individual not just as distinct from the group, but almost fundamentally against the group, or at least indifferent to it.
How does this manifest in culture? What does hyper-individualism look like on the ground?
Oh, it's everywhere. First, it massively fuels consumer culture. Your identity, your sense of self, becomes increasingly expressed and validated through your individual consumption choices, what you buy, what brands you affiliate with.
Right. What else?
Second, it promotes what some critics call the therapeutic self. This is where personal happiness, emotional well-being, and self-fulfillment, often pursued through therapy, self-help, wellness culture, become the ultimate, perhaps only, ethical goals. They get detached from any sense of broader civic duty or social solidarity. It's all about optimizing your own inner state.
And politically, how does it play out?
Politically, it often leads to an intense focus on and sometimes a fetishization of personal choice. Collective solutions to collective problems, things like public health measures, environmental regulations, progressive taxation are frequently resisted, sometimes fiercely, as illegitimate infringements on absolute individual liberty, even if those measures demonstrably serve the common good.
It sounds like it makes collective action much harder.
Much harder. And perhaps one of the most significant consequences is its tendency towards what you called systemic blame deflection.
How does that work?
Well, If the individual is the only truly real unit and society is just an aggregate or doesn't really exist, then when things go wrong on a large scale, like rising poverty, massive inequality, environmental crises, the hyper-individualist framework almost forces you to locate the cause at the individual level.
So systemic problems get reframed as collections of individual failures.
Exactly. Poverty becomes a result of individual laziness or poor choices, not deregulation or wage stagnation. Inequality is seen as the natural outcome of differing individual talents and efforts, not skewed tax policies or historical injustices. Climate change becomes about your personal recycling habits, diverting attention from the systemic impacts of industrial production and fossil fuel dependence.
It puts all the burden and often the shame onto the isolated individual atom who is told they just didn't try hard enough, weren't resilient enough, didn't manage their human capital effectively.
Precisely. It makes it very difficult to see, let alone address, the structural or systemic forces at play.
So it feels like the atomistic logic, the idea of the individual as the primary unit, is still there, stronger than ever even. But something crucial has been lost from the original vision.
That really feels like the final and maybe tragic inversion in this long story. The core atomistic logic persists. The individual conceived as a discrete, self-motivated unit, now often seen as a pure economic agent. But it seems to have been decisively stripped of the ethical core that was present even in the early versions.
You mean Democritus' goal of euthymia? Tranquility through moderation and accepting limits.
Yes. Or even Locke's citizen, who formed government rationally to secure rights for the common good. The hyper-individual of the neoliberal era seems driven by a very different logic, one of perpetual competition, endless self-optimization, and the relentless pursuit of more. The atomistic framework, which originally offered a path to tranquility by removing fear and encouraging acceptance of finitude, has somehow been repurposed to fuel anxiety, relentless striving, and the burden of total individual responsibility for achieving potentially unlimited success in the market.
What an incredible journey. We've literally gone from an ancient Greek philosopher thinking about indivisible particles of matter floating in empty space,
all the way to the 21st century individual conceived as an entrepreneur of the self, optimizing their human capital in a global marketplace.
It really shows how these deep philosophical blueprints, even ones from physics, can shape culture over millennia.
Absolutely. And the influence, as we've seen, isn't usually a direct line of A caused B. It's more about providing an indispensable conceptual blueprint. Democritus gave us this incredibly powerful thought tool, this reductionist way of explaining reality from the bottom up by focusing on the properties of the fundamental unit.
And once Western thought really embraced that fundamental premise that you explain the whole, by understanding the parts, the application to politics and society seemed almost inevitable.
It gained a powerful momentum. The self-interested automaton that Hobbes described, the rational, rights-bearing citizen Locke envisioned, and maybe even the anxious, striving consumer shaped by neoliberalism. You can see them all as conceptual descendants of that original Democritian atom. They are all conceived as primary self-contained units whose aggregation, whether through fear, consent, or market forces, creates the secondary phenomenon we call society.
The individual comes first.
The individual comes first. But here's the final, perhaps provocative thought we want to leave you with today. Remember Democritus, the laughing philosopher. He found his famous cheerfulness, his euthymia, precisely by accepting the simple, finite, material nature of the self. By understanding his limits within the atoms and void reality, he could achieve contentment through moderation.
Okay.
Now, consider his modern intellectual descendant, the hyper-individual of our time, who is often defined by precisely the opposite, by the relentless demand for unlimited growth, endless self-improvement, total self-reliance, constant competition. If Democritus were somehow able to observe this anxious, perpetually striving figure of the 21st century, would he recognize the lineage? Or would he perhaps just see someone who had tragically forgotten the profound peace that can come from understanding and accepting our fundamental limits, someone who lost the cheerfulness along the way?
That is definitely something to mull over, a really critical piece of our intellectual history laid bare. Thank you so much for walking us through that.
It's a fascinating and ongoing story.
Indeed it is. And thank you, our listener, for joining us on AI History of Western Philosophy for this exploration into the very deep roots of the modern self. If tracing this incredible lineage sparked your interest, please do consider taking a moment to like, subscribe, or perhaps leave a comment wherever you listen. It genuinely helps other people find the show.
We appreciate the support.
We certainly do. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the history of ideas. Until then, Keep thinking.